My name is Jordan Creed, and for 6 years I worked at Westboro Bridge and Hall, the boutique consulting firm founded by my wife's father, Derek Hall. Most people assumed I had it made, married to the boss's daughter, part of the inner circle. They saw me at company dinners, seated at the front with a mirror by my side, Derek giving me that self-satisfied grin that suggested I was one of his chosen few. But what they didn't see, what they didn't want to see, were the 12 rejections. 12 times I'd applied for a promotion I'd earned twice over. 12 times I'd sat across from Derek in his glass-walled office, watched him fold his hands like a benevolent god and deliver the same line in a dozen different ways. You're close, Jordan. Let's revisit this next quarter. I just need you to prove yourself a little longer. Every time he'd punctuate his words with that polished Theo smile, the one that never reached his eyes, and every time I'd swallow my pride and nod like a loyal son-in-law, because that's what everyone expected. That day, it was a Thursday, late summer, the kind of day where the sun poured through the blinds and cast sharp lines across the floor. I could smell the old leather of the chair he'd picked out himself, the faint scent of polish and aftershave lingering in the air like an accusation. He slid the folder across his desk, the motion so practiced it felt rehearsed. I'd memorized the shape of his hands, the way the veins stood out on the backs of them, the gold cufflinks glinting in the fluorescent light. I'd been here before, each time hoping this would be different, each time convincing myself he'd finally see me. But when he spoke, that measured tone, the one he used when he needed to be both mentor and gatekeeper, I already knew. You're close, Jordan. He said, I just need to see a bit more initiative in leadership. Let's revisit this next quarter. It was like hearing a scratched record. I felt the laugh bubbling up in my chest, but it wasn't a laugh of joy or relief or even disbelief. It was the laugh of a man who'd finally stopped caring. I let it out, one short bark of laughter, and Derek's eyes narrowed, the practice smile freezing on his face. Something funny? He asked, his voice sharp around the edges. I leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking under the shift of my weight, and let the silence stretch just long enough to let him know the spell was broken. No, I said. Nothing funny at all. I stood, leaving the folder unopened on the edge of his desk like a dare. Thanks for your time, Derek. His brows drew together, that fake concern creeping into his voice. Jordan, this isn't personal, he said, like he'd rehearsed that line too. Your family. I'm only looking out for what's best for the company. Family. That word hit like a slap. He'd used it as a shield for every slight, every rejection, every time he'd pulled the rug out from under me and expected me to thank him for the privilege. I felt the rage flicker and die, replaced by something colder, more resolute. Family. That was the line. That was the game. And I was done playing it. I walked out of that office and down the hallway, past the framed awards and the smiling portraits of Derek with his arm around senators and CEOs, past the receptionist who gave me a pitying smile like she'd just seen me get my heart broken. Maybe I had. Maybe that was the point. Because in that moment, in that final laugh, I knew I was done being the loyal son-in-law. I reached my desk, the same one they'd stuck me at for 6 years, next to the supply closet and the perpetually broken coffee machine. I sat down and stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. For a moment, I felt the weight of every late night I'd worked, every weekend I'd given up, every idea I'd shared that someone else had claimed as their own. I thought of Air, and how she'd always shrugged off my frustration with that same dismissive smile her father used. "He's just looking out for the company, Jordan," she'd say, sipping her wine and scrolling through her phone. Like my ambition was a minor inconvenience to be brushed aside. I thought of every maybe next quarter, every almost, every promise that turned to dust. And I felt the corners of my mouth twitch upward, not in a smile, but in the quiet resolve of a man who's done waiting. I stood again, feeling the blood rush in my ears, and looked around the office one last time. I saw the interns clustered in the corner, laughing at some inside joke they'd share on Slack later. I saw the senior partners huddled in Derek's office, strategizing how to land the next big contract. And I saw myself, reflected in the glass. A man wearing a suit that didn't quite fit anymore. The tie a little too tight around the neck. The eyes too tired from nights spent chasing approval that would never come. I reached for my bag and packed it slowly, methodically, as if every item I tucked away was a piece of my old life I was sealing off forever. Because in that moment, I wasn't just Jordan Creed, the man behind the desk at West Burbridge and Halt. I was something else. Something sharper, clearer, more dangerous. I was the man who'd finally stopped caring. And that made me free. I went home that night to Amira, my wife of 5 years, expecting at least a little concern in her eyes, a flicker of sympathy that would tell me she still saw me, not just the name on a paycheck or the placeholder in the Hulk dynasty. The apartment smelled like her favorite jasmine candles, the ones she always kept burning in the living room. She was already there, sitting on the couch with a glass of red wine in one hand and her phone in the other, scrolling mindlessly through a feed of influencers and overpriced handbags. The TV murmured some forgettable reality show in the background, casting soft blue shadows across her face. I dropped my bag by the door, the sound too loud in the silence between us. She barely looked up. "Hey," she said, her tone light, dismissive, as if I'd just come back from a long day of errands, instead of another humiliating meeting with her father. I moved toward her, hoping she'd catch the tension in my shoulders, the way my jaw was set too tight. But she just sipped her wine and tilted her head. "You okay?" she asked, like a reflex, no real question behind it. I let out a slow breath, trying to push down the anger that had been simmering all the way home. "Derek passed me over again," I said, my voice low but steady. I watched her eyes flick from the TV to me, saw the way she blinked once, twice, like she was trying to figure out what to say next. He said, "Maybe next quarter," I added, the bitterness seeping through again. "That's 12 times now, Amira. 12. She sighed and set her glass down on the coffee table with a soft clink. "Jordan," she began, her tone carrying that gentle condescension I'd come to recognize. The same tone Derek used when he told me to keep at it. "My dad knows what he's doing," she said, brushing an invisible speck of lint from her yoga pants. "He's built that firm from the ground up. Maybe you just need to show him you're ready." The words hit me like a slap. "Show him I'm ready," I repeated, my voice cracking with incredulity. "Amra, I've given that place everything. Every late night, every weekend, every ounce of me. And he just keeps moving the finish line. Doesn't that bother you?" She reached for her glass again, her eyes flicking back to her phone screen, fingers twitching like she was itching to check her notifications. "He's testing you," she said with a shrug. "That's how he measures loyalty." "You know that." The wine glass caught the light as she tilted it, a lazy swirl of crimson that seemed more interesting to her than my pain. Loyalty, I echoed, my voice suddenly sharp. Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like he's making sure I never outrun a shadow. She didn't answer right away, just sat there, legs crossed, one foot bouncing in that impatient way that always told me she was done with the conversation. Look, Jordan, she said finally, setting the glass down a little harder this time. You married into this family. You knew what you were signing up for. My chest tightened, the words sinking in like a stone. I knew I was signing up for a partnership, I said quietly, not a lifetime audition for a role I'll never get. Her eyes met mine then, and for a second I saw something flicker there. Doubt maybe, or regret, but it vanished as quickly as it came. She reached for her phone again, thumb scrolling, eyes drifting away. I'm sure he has his reasons, she said, her voice casual, almost bored. He always does. I stared at her, the room around us suddenly too quiet. The flickering TV screen like a cheap stage light on a performance I'd never signed up for. You knew, didn't you? I asked, the words catching in my throat. You knew he'd pass me over again, and you said nothing. She didn't even flinch, just shrugged and took another sip of wine. Jordan, it's not my place to get involved in his decisions. It's business. You know how he is. Business. That word hung in the air between us like a curse. I stood, my legs suddenly unsteady, and turned away from her, staring at the row of family photos on the bookshelf. Pictures of us at parties, at company events, at dinner with Derek and his wife, all smiles, all pretending we were one big, happy family. But I knew now that I'd been the only one pretending. I thought about every conversation with Derek where he'd praised me just enough to keep me hanging on. Every time he'd used a leverage, like a pawn in his game. And I thought about how she'd let him. That night, I didn't sleep in our bed. I grabbed a pillow from the couch, the one that still smelled faintly of her shampoo, and I lay down in the living room, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun slowly, like the days of my life being eaten away by a machine I couldn't stop. I didn't sleep. I didn't even close my eyes because the thing I'd been afraid to admit, the thing I'd refused to see, had finally come into focus. This wasn't just about a promotion. It wasn't just about Derek or West Bridbridge and Holt. It was about the person I trusted most in the world. The person who'd promised to stand beside me, choosing silence instead of loyalty, choosing him instead of me. By morning, the jasmine scent had faded, replaced by the cold smell of betrayal that clung to the walls like smoke. I sat up slowly, feeling the weight of the decision that had already been made inside me. This was the line in the sand. The moment I stopped waiting for validation and started writing my own story. And as the sun broke through the blinds, washing the living room in pale gold light, I felt something inside me shift. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. I'd never be the same man again, and I didn't want to be. Because the one thing that was suddenly crystal clear, painfully, beautifully clear, was that the betrayal wasn't just professional. It was personal, and that meant the game had changed forever. I didn't rage. I didn't quit. I did something far more dangerous. I started documenting. Every system I created, every process I refined, every spreadsheet I built when Derek's so-called visionary hires failed to deliver, I quietly documented. I'd always been meticulous by nature. The guy who saved every version, who left a trail of breadcrumbs so no detail was ever truly lost. But now, every click of the save button felt different, intentional. Like a soldier building a fortress no one else could see. I didn't do it for them anymore. I did it for me. It started small. A file labeled Personal Notes on my desktop. Inside, I mapped the architecture of our biggest client deliverables. The way I'd streamlined Halberg's financial analytics module after their CTO left mid-project. The custom dashboards I'd built for Clearstone's logistics team when their internal devs botched the integration. All the hidden linchpins no one else had the patience or skill to fix. I listed every patch, every code snippet, every workaround I devised to keep Derek's promises alive. Each note felt like a step away from the loyal son-in-law they had molded me to be, and a step closer to the man I was becoming. I called it my indispensability map, not because I wanted to stay, I'd already decided that much, but because I wanted a record of every brick I'd laid, every nail I'd driven, every night I'd spent fixing what Derek and his hand-picked golden children couldn't. It wasn't about making myself too valuable to fire. That ship had sailed. It was about knowing my worth and proving, at least to myself, that I'd been the spine holding up the house all along. During the day, I played the helpful team player. I kept my smile sharp and my tone measured. I attended leadership huddles, gave calm, measured input. I mentored the juniors, the bright-eyed kids who still thought every happy hour and every compliment from Derek was a promise instead of a leash. I taught them how to patch the same broken systems I'd been patching for years. How to keep the gears turning when the engine was already half dead. And at night, I was something else entirely. Every late night from then on was a step away from West Burbridge and Hall and a step toward the life I wanted. I started small. Registering the domain for Veritas Consulting Group felt like a guilty pleasure at first. A name, a logo, a shell company that lived only on my hard drive. But that digital placeholder was more than just an idea. It was a declaration. I would not let them define my worth anymore. I would build something that didn't depend on Derek's approval. Something I could own without strings attached to a family name I'd grown tired of carrying like a burden. I didn't skip a beat at work. That was the genius of it. Derek's inner circle still saw me as the loyal son-in-law, the reliable fixer, the guy who'd always show up with the right answer. I kept playing that role with Oscar-worthy precision. When the project manager flubbed the Clearstone timeline, I stayed late to fix it again. When Halberg's CIO asked why their analytics reports kept failing, I smiled and said I'd look into it again. Every time I solved a problem, I added it to my indispensability map. Every time I saved the day, I documented the exact step-by-step I'd used to do it. I was building an instruction manual for my own escape, one carefully documented line at a time. It's funny how easy it was to keep smiling while I built my exit strategy. I'd always been good at reading a room and knowing when to nod and when to stay quiet. I'd watched Derek for years, the way he played people, the way he spun half-truths into gold-plated lies. I realized somewhere along the way that he'd been teaching me how to play the same game, only I wasn't playing for him anymore. I was playing for me. One night, around 11, I was still at the office. The glow from my monitor lit the desk like a miniature sun. I leaned back and looked around the floor. Darkened cubicles, the hush of abandoned coffee cups and paper stacks. A few scattered desks with screens still on. Blue light flickering like ghostly fires in the night. I thought about all the times I'd stayed late fixing other people's mistakes. The times I'd walked past Derek's office and seen him packing up at 5 with that grin on his face. The times Amira had called, annoyed that I'd missed dinner again, and I'd apologized, promised I'd make it up to her. Promises I'd known even then were already broken. I turned back to my screen and opened the latest version of my indispensability map. I read through the lines of code I'd written, the notes I'd scribbled in the margins of project plans, the subtle tweaks I'd made to legacy systems that only I understood. I thought about the architecture of West Bridge and Halt, the thin scaffolding holding up a brand that had always been more show than substance. I realized in that moment that the only thing keeping the place from falling apart was me. And that knowledge settled over me like armor. I didn't hate Derek anymore. That was the irony. I didn't even hate Amira. They were who they were. The game had been rigged from the start, but I learned to play it better than they ever had. I'd learned to see the cracks in the foundation, the places where their vision fell apart without me to hold it up. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark, letting the hum of the servers fill the silence. I wasn't afraid of what came next. I was ready, because I didn't rage. I didn't quit. I did something far more dangerous. I started documenting. And that was the day Jordan Creed stopped being the man behind the desk and started becoming the man behind the plan. 3 of our top clients, Hallberg Systems, Clearstone Health, and Rovian MedTech, relied on me directly. Not on Derek, not on his so-called visionaries, on me. They didn't know all the politics at West Bridge and Halt, but they knew this. When something went wrong, when deadlines slipped or bugs threatened to derail launches, they called me. Not the project managers, not the high-priced consultants who parachuted in for the glory and left the real work to people like me. I was the one who rolled up his sleeves, who understood their systems, who had walked them through crises and kept them from losing face with their own boards. I was the one who answered the phone at 2 in the morning when their CIOS couldn't sleep. I was the glue that kept everything together, and I think deep down Derek knew it too. Though he'd never admit it out loud, that knowledge was power. I started mapping it all. Every client contact, every system dependency, every single place where my experience couldn't be replicated by a glossy presentation or a smiling promise. I didn't do it to sabotage them. No, that wasn't my style. I did it because I needed to understand just how deep the hooks went. I needed to know where I ended and West Bridge began. And the more I mapped, the more I saw the truth. They hadn't promoted me because they couldn't afford to. I'd become too important to lose. That was the secret they'd never say out loud. They built a company that was too dependent on one man they refused to acknowledge. I started with Hallberg. I'd redesigned their logistics tracking after their CTO walked out, rebuilt their analytics stack, trained their staff on every new module. I was the reason their quarterly reports didn't melt down every earnings call. I documented every process, how the data pipeline worked, how the integration with their legacy systems could break if you didn't follow my exact sequence. Then I moved on to Clearstone. Their entire dashboard interface from patient intake to billing was my brainchild. Derek had promised them a cutting-edge platform, but when the vendor software fell apart, it was me, working weekends and nights, who had stitched it back together. I listed every patch, every custom script, every workaround that made it function seamlessly. Finally, Rovian, their regulatory compliance tracker, had been a mess. I'd build a new one from scratch, anticipating every audit point, every workflow bottleneck. I made it so they could sleep at night, knowing their patient data wouldn't end up on the front page of the journal. As I documented, I saw the patterns, the dependencies that no one else had bothered to understand. Every time they'd asked me to fix it, I'd done so without question. But now, I wasn't just fixing things. I was learning. I was building a roadmap of the company's backbone, and it all pointed to me. I wasn't cocky enough to think I was irreplaceable, but I was smart enough to know they'd bleed before they could fill the gaps. And that was a power I'd never realized I had. It changed how I walked the halls. When Derek's latest golden boy needed help prepping for a client demo, I was there with a polite smile and a few well-placed insights that made him look good, but only because I chose to. When the partners gathered for strategy huddles, I sat at the edge of the table, listening, storing every word. Not because I wanted to be included, but because I wanted to know exactly how much they depended on me. They had no idea I was planning my own exit. I didn't need to brag or posture. I had the receipts, the data, the hard evidence that the glue they'd taken for granted all these years was the only thing keeping the place from falling apart. I'd always been good at blending in and making myself seem like the team player, the guy who would go the extra mile. But inside, something had shifted. I'd become the man who understood every lever, every choke point, every dependency that ran through the heart of the firm. I knew the systems they couldn't navigate without me. I knew the relationships they'd neglected and the ones they'd abused. I knew the passwords. I knew the codes. I knew the subtle ways you could make a system misbehave if the wrong hand tried to run it. And I didn't need to lift a finger to make that happen. It would happen all by itself, because no one else had ever bothered to learn how to fix the messes they created. Sometimes I catch Derek's eye during one of our all-hands meetings, those pep rallies where he'd talk about synergy and vision like they were magic words. He'd smile, that CEO smile at me, the one that said, "Good soldier." And I'd smile back knowing he had no idea what I'd build in the shadows. He thought he was the glue holding this place together, but he was wrong. He was the face on the brochure, the voice on the conference calls, the man who took the credit. But he wasn't the glue. I was. In the evenings, I'd walk the empty halls after the lights dimmed, looking at the rows of cubicles and glass-walled offices. I think about the people who'd passed through here, the ones who'd come in bright-eyed and eager, only to leave burned out and disillusioned. I think about the times I'd picked up the pieces of their broken projects, the times I'd shielded clients from the fallout of Derek's arrogance. And I'd smile, because I knew something he didn't. I knew I'd earned every ounce of the respect those clients had for me. I knew I'd built something real in a place that only cared about appearances. The irony wasn't lost on me. Derek had spent years talking about legacy, about building something that would last. But he'd built a house of cards held together by one man he refused to acknowledge. And that man was me. Every late night, every early morning, every crisis averted, every problem solved. I'd been the glue, and I'd been holding them all together. And now, finally, I was ready to let go, because the glue was mine to withhold. In secret, I registered Vereritas Consulting Group. The name itself felt like a rebellion, a quiet, defiant act of ownership over my future. I chose Vereritas because it meant truth. And after years of smiling through Derek's half-truths and manipulations, I wanted my next chapter to be built on something real. It started small. A domain name, a logo sketched on a napkin in the back of a coffee shop, a blank website with a single phrase that said, "Coming soon." But even that felt like oxygen. It was mine. It didn't have Derek's fingerprints on it. No ties to the whole name, just me and the work I'd spent years perfecting. I didn't rush. That was the key. I knew if I moved too fast, Derek would catch on. He had his people, his ways of making sure no one strayed too far from the plantation. So I took my time. I'd slip out during lunch for quiet coffees with old colleagues, people I trained or mentored who had moved on to other firms or started their own journeys. We'd meet at out-of-the-way places, cafes with cracked formica tables or low-lit wine bars that didn't attract the after-work crowd from Westbridge. I'd ask them about their projects, their frustrations. I'd listen more than I spoke. Just checking in, I'd say with a casual smile, as if I were catching up for old time's sake. But every word I said was calculated, every question designed to plant a seed, a reminder that I was still out there, still building something, still someone who could help them if things ever got too messy where they were. I didn't make any promises. That was important. No poaching, no sales pitch, just subtle hints that I understood their pain points, that I knew what it was like to be stuck in a place that saw you as expendable. And I let them connect the dots themselves. Let them remember the times I'd bailed them out, the times I'd given them solutions no one else at Westbridge had the patience or insight to find. I was planting seeds, not pulling up roots. And it was working. Meanwhile, at the office, I wore my usual mask. I still showed up early, still stayed late, still fixed things no one else could fix. Derek had no idea. His golden hires were too busy chasing his approval to notice I was building a quiet army of loyalty. People who didn't even work at Westbridge anymore, but who remembered me when their backs were against the wall. People who, when the time came, would pick up the phone and call me first. I could see it in the way they responded to my messages. A warmth that had nothing to do with company logos or holiday cards. It was respect, the kind that can't be faked or bought. And I knew that was my real insurance policy, not some ironclad non-compete or a golden handshake from Derek. No, my insurance was the relationships I'd built, the reputation I'd earned by showing up when it mattered most. At home, I kept up the performance too. Amira would ask about my day and I'd tell her just enough to keep the illusion alive. Just the usual, I'd say, smiling as I rinsed dishes or folded laundry. Another crisis averted. She'd nod and sip her wine, scrolling through her phone, never asking too many questions. I wondered if she even cared anymore, or if she'd always been more invested in the idea of me as Derek's loyal soldier than in the man himself. Either way, I was past caring. I wasn't doing this for her approval. I was doing it for me. One night I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, the glow of the screen painting my face in shades of determination. I stared at the logo I designed, Veritas Consulting Group, in clean, confident lines. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not in the sense of ego or arrogance, but in the quiet certainty that I was finally building something on my own terms, something no one could take away from me. I thought about all the times Derek had told me I wasn't quite ready, all the times he'd smiled that patronizing smile and handed the promotion to someone else. And I realized I'd been ready all along. He'd just been too afraid to admit it. I reached out to one of my old contacts at Clearstone Health, a woman named Tasha, who'd always treated me with respect, who'd trusted me with some of their most sensitive systems. Just wondering how things are going, I wrote, keeping it breezy. She responded within minutes. Rough, honestly, she wrote. Our dashboards keep failing. I miss having you around. I smiled as I read her message. Another seed planted. Another subtle reminder that I was still the guy who could make her problems go away. Every conversation was a stitch in the fabric of my future, a thread connecting me to the life I wanted to build. And with every passing day, the old life at Westbridge and Hull felt less like a home and more like a cage I'd outgrown. I still wore the suit, still took the meetings, still played the part. But inside, I was miles away. I was building something that couldn't be boxed in by Derek's games or Air's indifference. I was building freedom. It wasn't about revenge anymore.
That had been my first instinct. But as the days went by, I realized it wasn't enough. I didn't just want to watch Westbird crumble. I wanted to rise. I wanted to show myself and the world that I'd been more than a name on someone else's roster. That I was the architect of my own destiny. That I didn't need Derek's approval or his last-minute maybe next quarter carrot. I had my own map now, my own plan. And every quiet coffee, every subtle nod, every seed I planted was a step closer to the moment I'd walk away. Not with bitterness or anger, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had built his own empire from the ashes of their neglect. I didn't need their permission. I'd already given it to myself. And that was the most powerful thing of all. Exactly 6 months after rejection number 12, I walked into Derek's office with a calm that felt earned. I'd spent the night before rehearsing the conversation, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to savor every word, every second of the exit I'd been planning for years. The office smelled like leather and ambition, his signature cologne still lingering in the air, the subtle reminder that this space had always been his domain, not mine. But today, I was the one with the power. Today, I was the one who decided when the conversation ended. I wore my best suit, the one Amira had bought me for our anniversary, the year Derek had passed me over for the first time. It still fit perfectly, tailored, precise, the way I'd built every system that held this place together. I'd made sure to polish my shoes, to straighten my tie just right, because I knew Derek valued appearances. He taught me that, even if he'd never said it outright. Appearances were everything at West Burbridge and Holt, right up until they weren't. He looked up as I entered, his eyes flickering with that same mixture of calculation and condescension he'd perfected over the years. "Jordan," he said, voice smooth, leaning back in his chair like a king greeting a favorite subject. "Sit down." But I didn't sit. I placed the crisp white envelope on the polished mahogany desk. No hesitation, no apology, just a simple offering that would change everything. His smile faltered as he picked it up, turning it over like it might bite him. "What's this?" he asked, his tone already shifting as narrowing as he scanned my face for weakness. I held his gaze steady, refusing to blink. "It's my resignation," I said, my voice calm. Even effective 2 weeks from today, as per company policy, the words felt like freedom, every syllable a key turning in a lock I'd been trapped behind for too long. He stared at the envelope like it was a snake coiled to strike. "You're quitting?" he said, his voice higher now, like he couldn't quite believe it. In the middle of a product migration? I almost laughed. The product migration that I had saved time and time again, the one his so-called top hires had fumbled more than once. I wanted to remind him of every time he'd called me at midnight, every time he'd said, "Jordan, I need you to fix this." But I didn't. I didn't owe him that anymore. I nodded once. "Yes," I said. 2 weeks' notice as per policy. I could see the calculations firing behind his eyes. The panic, the disbelief, the dawning realization that the glue was leaving. "We were just about to promote you," he said. The words rushed like he was grasping at a lifeline. I was advocating hard for Q3. That was his favorite game. Always the next quarter. Always the promise that never came. I played along for too long. "That's the game, isn't it?" I said. The bitterness gone now, replaced by something clearer, harder. Always next quarter. Always a carrot. I'm done chasing. His face reened, a vein in his temple throbbing like a silent alarm. "Don't do this," he said, his tone suddenly softer, almost pleading. "Your family. We've invested in you." Family. That word again. The chain he'd wrapped around my neck for 6 years. The leash he'd yanked whenever he needed me to smile and play along. I leaned forward, planting my hands on his desk, my voice low but unshakable. "No," I said. "I invested in you every late night, every system I fixed, every time I saved this firm from its own arrogance. I gave you everything, Derek, and every time you gave me the same line. Next quarter." I straightened, leaving the words hanging in the air like a final verdict. "This is my quarter now." He blinked, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. I saw the panic in his eyes, the fear of what would happen when I wasn't there to patch the leaks, to keep the clients from bolting, and I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Not revenge, but justice. He'd spent years playing me, but in the end, I'd learned to play the game better than he ever could. "Jordan," he said finally, his voice trembling, a note of desperation in it. "Now we can work this out. Let's talk about a raise, a promotion, an executive title, whatever you want." I almost laughed at that. I'd wanted those things once, but not anymore. Titles and raises were his currency. But I'd already built my own bank. "No," I said, my voice quiet but resolute. "You can't buy what I'm leaving with." He didn't get it, and I didn't expect him to, because what I was taking with me wasn't just knowledge or contacts. It was the confidence of a man who'd finally stopped asking for permission. I turned and walked toward the door, my steps measured, my back straight. I felt his eyes on me, felt the weight of the office I'd given so much to. The place that had once felt like the center of my world. But it wasn't my world anymore. It was his, and I didn't belong there. I reached for the door handle, pausing for just a second to glance over my shoulder. He was still there, staring at the resignation letter like it was a bomb he hadn't learned how to defuse. 2 weeks, I said. Use them wisely. Then I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The light from the overhead fluorescence bright and blinding. But I didn't care because for the first time in 6 years I felt light. I felt free. I felt like a man who had finally taken back his name, his life, his worth. And I knew with every step I took away from Derek's office that there was no going back. This was my goodbye letter, my declaration of independence, and nothing. No promotion, no raise, no desperate promise. Whatever changed that, the collapse didn't start with fireworks or a shouting match. It started with silence. A stillness that slipped between the cracks of West Bridge and halt like a ghost. A quiet that no one noticed until it was too late. It began with an email from Clearstone CIO, one I'd read on my phone while sipping coffee in the break room. "Jordan, can we talk about the dashboard errors?" it said. "Your team hasn't been responding." My team. Funny how they called it that, even though I'd always been a team of one. I'd fixed their analytics stack single-handedly, spent hours on their regulatory interface, trained their staff until they could practically recite my code by heart. And now, they were noticing the silence. I left the email unanswered, at least for a while. Let it sit. Let it breathe. Let Derek and his hand-picked protégés wonder why the pipeline they depended on for years wasn't humming along like it always had. Then came the call from Hauberg's CTO, a small panic in her voice. "Jordan, We've got errors in the logistics module. We need your insight. Can you jump on a call? Again, I paused. Not because I wanted to sabotage them. No, that was never the goal. But because I needed them to understand what they'd never acknowledged. I was the one holding this place together. Not Derek. Not his golden boys. Me. Meanwhile, Derek was panicking. He started showing up earlier, his shirts less crisp, his hair a little out of place. I'd catch glimpses of him in the hallways, pacing, eyes darting around like he expected a crisis to leap out from every corner. He'd corner me in the break room with that co-smile stretched too tight. "Jordan, I know we got off on the wrong foot with that resignation," he'd say, "but let's be reasonable. I can offer you a raise, an executive title, whatever you want." I'd listen politely, sipping my coffee, but inside I was already gone, because my clients, my real clients, had already started reaching out to me privately. They didn't trust Westbridge and Hold anymore. They trusted me. Every time Derek made me an offer, I declined politely, calmly. Each refusal felt like a hammer hitting the foundation he'd built on my back. It wasn't rage, not anymore. It was a simple, inevitable truth. When the person who holds your house together leaves, the walls start to buckle. And that was exactly what happened. The boardroom, once the scene of his chest-thumping speeches about vision and synergy, turned into a ghost town. Half the meetings were labeled urgent, but none of them produced real solutions. The partners scrambled, trying to fill the void I'd left, but they couldn't, because I hadn't just been a technician. I'd been the architect, the one who knew where every piece fit, where every system connected, where every process could and often did fail if left in the wrong hands. It was subtle at first. Delayed updates, emails marked high priority that never got answered, dashboards that failed in the middle of client demos. Then the CIO at Halberg called Derek directly, asking why Jordan hadn't responded to her latest request. I could only imagine the look on Derek's face when he realized he didn't have the answer. I'd given him every chance to see my worth, every opportunity to treat me like a partner instead of a pawn. But he'd never learned. And now the silence was teaching him what my words never could. He tried everything: a raise, a backdated promotion, an executive title. He even summoned me to his office one last time, his voice desperate, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. "Jordan," he said, his hands gripping the edge of his desk like it might float away without him. "We need you." I was wrong. I see that now. You're the glue. I'll give you anything. Just name it. I stood there watching him unravel, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of pity. But it passed, because this wasn't just about me. It was about every time he dismissed me, every time he'd stolen my ideas, every time he'd used my loyalty as a shield for his own incompetence. "I'm sorry, Derek," I said, my voice calm but unyielding. "I can't come back. I have other commitments now." His face fell like a man realizing the oxygen had been cut off and there was no backup tank. "Jordan, please," he said, his voice cracking. "Think about the team. Think about the clients." I shook my head slowly. "I did," I said. "For 6 years I thought about them every night, and that's why I'm leaving. Because you never did." He leaned back, his shoulders slumping under the weight of a truth he couldn't deny. I turned and walked out, the click of the door handle like the final note in a song that had played too long. In the hall I paused, letting the quiet settle around me. It wasn't the angry silence of a man walking away in a rage. It was the peaceful silence of a man who'd finally reclaimed his name, his dignity, his power. Back at my desk, I checked my messages. 2 new client inquiries at Veritas. People who'd heard through the grapevine that I was building something better, something real. I smiled because I hadn't recruited them. They'd come to me. Loyalty doesn't lie. And that was something Derek would never understand. In the days that followed, the collapse at Westbridge and Halt became a slow-motion train wreck. I watched from a safe distance. Emails piled up in the shared inbox with no one to answer them. Project managers flailed, trying to piece together systems they'd never cared to understand. Clients started looking elsewhere, first quietly, then openly. And through it all, I worked at Veritas, building something that felt honest, something that felt like mine. Because collapse doesn't always come with a bang. Sometimes it comes with silence. And sometimes that's the loudest sound of all. On my last day at West Beerbridge and Hold, the boardroom looked like a funeral home dressed in corporate drag. The chairs were half occupied, the once pristine whiteboard strewed with the remnants of abandoned strategy sessions. A coffee ring here, a scribbled Q4 targets there. Even Derek, Mr. Always in Control, looked like he'd aged a decade in a week. His tie was loosened, his hair mussed, his eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights and too many panic calls. The golden boy hires who used to smirk at me during presentations now looked at the floor, their faces pale as if the air itself was poisonous. I walked in carrying only a small box of my things, a couple of framed certificates they'd given me back when I still believed the accolades meant something, a handful of pins I bought with my own money, the mug that said, "World's Best Dad." Even though my kids had given it to me years before I started working here, I didn't need the box, but I wanted the ritual. I wanted to look them in the eye as I left to see the cost of their decisions. Derek was waiting, standing by the head of the table like a man bracing for execution. His eyes darted up as I approached, and for a second I thought he might actually say thank you. But then his mask slipped back into place. "Jordan," he said, his voice scratchy like he'd been practicing the speech all night. "Let's talk." I set the box down on the edge of the table and folded my arms, waiting. He gestured to the empty seat across from him, the one I'd occupied so many times while he explained why I wasn't quite enough. But I didn't sit. I stood, letting him see that this conversation was happening on my terms. "Look," he started, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "I know things haven't always been perfect between us, but we're at a crossroads now. The clients are rattled. The team's morale is shot. You leaving right now? It's a gut punch. Jordan, I need you." I raised an eyebrow, the corners of my mouth twitching at the irony. "You need me?" I asked, savoring the words. "Funny how that never came up during those 12 promotions you passed me over for." He winced, and for the first time in years, I saw a crack in his armor. "Look, I'm not perfect," he said, voice raw. "I've made mistakes, but you've always been part of this family, Jordan. We can fix this. I'll double your salary, equity, whatever you want. Just stay." It was almost comical, the desperation in his eyes, the way he clung to the idea that money and titles could patch the hole he'd carved into this place. But he didn't get it. He'd never get it, because it was never about the money. It was about respect, about loyalty, about the trust he'd eroded one rejection at a time. I leaned in just enough so he could see the resolve in my eyes. "You can't fix this with a check." "Derek," I said, "you taught me that when you passed me over for the last time. When you made it clear I'd never be more than the son-in-law, the loyal soldier who'd always be second to your visionaries. His jaw clenched, his eyes darting to the door like he wanted to run. But I kept going because I needed him to understand, really understand why this was happening. I gave you everything, I said, my voice low but unshakable. I carried this place when your stars couldn't deliver. I built the systems that saved your deals, the dashboards that saved your reputation. And every time you said, next quarter, I waited. But I'm done waiting, Derek. I'm done being the glue you only notice when it's gone. Silence filled the room like a fog, thick and heavy. The partners, Derek's yes-men, who'd always smirked at my loyalty, couldn't meet my eyes. One of them cleared his throat as if he might actually speak up, but then thought better of it. Derek tried one last time, his voice trembling. Jordan, think about what you're throwing away. The relationships you've built, the trust you've earned. You walk out that door and it's over. We can't protect you out there. I let out a slow breath, studying myself. That's where you're wrong, I said. Because the relationships weren't with Westbridge and Halt. They were with me. I was the one they called at midnight. I was the one they trusted to deliver. You think you own them, but you don't. You never did. His face crumpled then, like a man realizing his empire was built on borrowed time. Don't do this, he whispered, his voice so quiet I almost missed it. Don't throw away what we've built. I picked up my box, feeling its weight settle into my palm. We didn't build it, I said. I did, and now I'm building something of my own. As I turned to leave, I felt their eyes on my back. Fear, disbelief, maybe even a little respect. The elevator ride down felt different than every other time. Like every floor I passed was a layer of dead skin I was finally shedding. By the time the doors opened to the lobby, I felt lighter than I'd felt in years. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Cars honking, people rushing, the sun hitting the glass towers like a promise. I took a deep breath and let it fill my lungs. A fresh start written in every exhale. I wasn't just leaving a job. I was reclaiming my dignity, my purpose, my future. Because when the table turns, it's not about winning or losing. It's about choosing. And I chose me. Veritas Consulting Group wasn't just a name on a door. It was everything I learned from years of being overlooked, from every next quarter Derek had dangled in front of me, from every system I built that no one else could manage. It was the embodiment of all the lessons they taught me without meaning to. That loyalty is a currency they'd spent too freely. That talent is a resource they'd abused without ever nurturing. At Veritas, I wasn't building an empire. I was building a sanctuary, a place where people were more than disposable cogs in a machine. We started small, just me in a one-room office with a second-hand desk and a whiteboard that had seen better days. But there was a fire in me that no windowless office could dampen. I poured everything I had into those early days, designing pitch decks, rewriting code for the platforms I'd once rescued under Derek's name, sketching business plans on scraps of paper that cluttered my desk like autumn leaves. Every late night at Westbridge had taught me something: how to lead, how to build, how to inspire. Now, I was applying all of it, but on my terms. Clients came slowly at first, then with a momentum that felt almost inevitable. Not because I stole them. No, I refused to make the same cheap moves Derek would have. But because they called me. The CIO at Clearstone reached out within weeks telling me they'd decided to take their analytics project to Veritas exclusively. "We just don't trust the team at West Burbridge anymore," she'd said, her voice apologetic but firm. And that was the difference. Trust, not titles or logos. Trust, the foundation Derek had never truly built. Halberg followed next, citing ongoing system failures that Westbridge just couldn't fix. I'd known those systems inside out, but I'd always made sure to document them with integrity. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't have to. The rot at Westbridge had been there all along. Years of shortcuts, half-finished solutions, and people like me propping up their reputation. Now the truth was catching up with them. And I was the only one with the blueprint to make it right. Veritas didn't just grow, it thrived. I hired Khaled, a senior strategist Derek had once called too green to handle complex projects. I remembered Khaled's sharp mind and steady focus, the way he'd taken notes like every word mattered. He became my right hand at Veritas. No ego, just talent. Naomi, the UX designer who'd been sidelined for too long at Westbridge, was next. I'd watched her transform dull interfaces into intuitive experiences no one else appreciated. At Veritas, she was more than a pair of hands. She was a creative force who made our project shine. I gave them titles that meant something, roles that matched their abilities, and space to grow without fear of someone else taking the credit. We built processes that valued people. Weekly stand-ups where everyone had a voice, not just the loudest one. Reviews that focused on learning, not blame. Systems that actually worked because we designed them to fit the client's needs, not Derek's need for a fancy brochure. Every day felt like progress. Every day felt like the opposite of Westbridge. It wasn't just about making money. It was about building something honest, something real. 6 months in, we closed our first six-figure retainer. Clearstone signed an exclusive deal with us that made headlines in the industry press. The email came through at midnight, the subject line reading, simply, "It's official." I sat in my office with the lights off, the city lights spilling through the blinds, and let the moment sink in. It wasn't luck. It wasn't revenge. It was respect. Respect I'd earned. Respect they'd given freely because they knew I'd always show up for them. I thought about every time Derek had told me I wasn't ready. Every time he'd said, "Maybe next quarter." And I smiled because I built something he couldn't even see coming. Halberg soon followed. They'd grown tired of Westbridge's delays, of the half-hearted solutions they'd been sold. They wanted real results. They wanted Veritas. I didn't gloat when the contract came through. I didn't post a triumphant message online. I didn't have to, because this wasn't about proving Derek wrong anymore. This was about proving myself right. Every time a client signed with us, it was a vote of confidence in the way we worked, in the respect we showed, in the value we delivered. I watched my team grow. Naomi bringing in designers who'd been underused elsewhere. Khaled mentoring junior strategists with a patience I'd always admired. I felt proud not just of what we'd built, but of the people who'd chosen to build it with me. I remembered how it felt to be overlooked, and I vowed that no one at Veritas would ever feel that way. No one would ever wonder if they mattered. No one would ever have to wait for next quarter to be recognized. We were agile, we were hungry, and we were accountable. Every late night felt different now, lighter, even joyous. We were building something honest, and it showed in the way clients responded, in the way our team showed up, and the way every new contract felt like a small revolution against the old way of doing things. I didn't just want Veritas to succeed.
I wanted it to redefine what success looked like for me, for my team, for every client who'd ever been let down by people like Derek. Sitting in my office late one night, I thought about the journey from West Barbridge and Holt to here. The lessons, the betrayals, the silences that had taught me to trust my own instincts. I realized then that I'd never have to ask for permission again. I'd never have to wait for someone else to see my worth, because I'd already built it brick by brick, code by code, relationship by relationship. And in that moment, I knew that Veraritas wasn't just my company. It was my vindication, my freedom, my future. It was proof that the man they'd overlooked, the man they'd underestimated, was the man who'd been holding them all together. And now, finally, he built something they could never touch. Something that was mine. 1 year to the day after I'd left West Bridge and Hold, I was sitting in my new office at Veraritas. Real wood paneling on the walls, soft ambient lighting, the faint scent of good coffee in the air. It was late, but I didn't mind the hours anymore. At Veraritas, every hour felt like an investment, not a sacrifice. The hum of the city below filtered through the window, a steady reminder of the life I built on my own terms. That's when the call came. My phone lit up with Derek's name, the same man who'd passed me over 12 times, the man who'd taught me the price of loyalty and corporate currency. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, letting the names sink in. I thought of all the times he'd brushed me aside, all the times he'd smiled that CEO smiled and promised next quarter. I thought of every late night, every system I'd saved, every client I'd kept from walking out the door because of his mismanagement. Now he was the one calling me. I let it ring twice before I answered, calm and composed. "Jordan Creed," I said, my voice steady, the same voice I'd used in 100 client meetings. But this time it felt different. There was a pause, a hesitation I'd never heard from Derek. Then, in a voice that sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it, he spoke. "Jordan, let's talk merger." His tone tried for confident but landed somewhere closer to desperate. "Veritas and West. Imagine what we could do together." I leaned back in my chair, the leather cool against my skin, and let the silence stretch. I could almost see him in his office, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. I pictured the cracks in his kingdom, clients leaving, dashboards failing, juniors fumbling with processes they'd never bothered to learn. I pictured the empire I'd built, the clients who'd come to me because I'd always delivered, the team I'd assembled who believed in what we were building. "Derek," I said slowly, savoring every syllable, "the man you passed over 12 times doesn't exist anymore." I could hear his breath catch, a faint hitch that told me he was still playing catch-up. "Jordan, come on," he said, his voice cracking in places. "We both know West Bridge has the reach, the infrastructure. We've got the legacy." Legacy, that word again. I let out a quiet laugh. Not mocking, just sad. "Legacy is what people say when they're afraid of change," I said, when they're afraid to admit the game has moved on without them. "Don't do this," he said, his tone urgent now. "We're stronger together. Think about what we could build." I let out a slow breath. "Derek, I already did." I paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "And I built it without you." There was silence on the other end, the kind that says everything you need to hear. I pictured him staring at his phone, realizing that all the power he'd once held had vanished with my final walk out the door. I thought of the times he'd held my future like a carrot on a stick,
always out of reach. I thought of the days I'd spent waiting for him to see me, to promote me, to treat me like an equal. And I realized in that moment that I didn't need him anymore. I never had. "Jordan," he said, a last-ditch effort to salvage the moment. "Just think about it. We could." I cut him off, my voice firm but calm. "No, Derek," I said. "I don't need to merge. I already won." I ended the call, setting the phone down gently on the desk. I stared at the city lights outside. Each window a different story, a different possibility. I felt lighter than I'd ever felt. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about proving myself right. That I was worth it. That I'd always been worth it. Because revenge isn't rage. Revenge is rising. It's building something better, something honest, something no one can take away. It's the look in Ked's eyes when he closed his first big contract and thanked me for believing in him. It's the smile on Naomi's face when she saw her designs come to life without someone else's name slapped on them. It's the way my clients called me, not because they were desperate, but because they trusted me. I looked around my office at the photos of my team at our first big launch party. No fancy suits, no forced smiles, just real people who had chosen to build something that mattered. I thought of the laughter, the collaboration, the long nights that felt like family dinners instead of forced over time. I thought of the systems we'd built together, the partnerships we'd forged, the culture we'd created that made people want to show up and do their best. I reached for the whiteboard and wrote one word in big, bold letters. Freedom. Because that's what this was. Not just financial freedom or career freedom, but freedom from the lies I'd been told. Freedom from the people who tried to box me in. Freedom from the man I'd been when I'd walked into Derek's office for the first time, bright-eyed and eager to please. My phone buzzed again. A text from Colette. "Client call tomorrow at 10. They want to expand the scope." I smiled. The work never ended, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a privilege. I turned off the lamp and let the darkness settle in, the city lights painting patterns on the ceiling. I thought about that first day I'd stepped into West Burbridge and Halt, full of hope and ambition, and I whispered a quiet thank you to the man I'd been, to the lessons I'd learned, to the people who'd made me stronger. Because the final call wasn't Derek's. It was mine, and I'd answered it.